"You're coming with me," said the lonely rancher to the woman beaten for giving birth to triplet girls. Wyoming Territory, late January, 1877. High ridges of the Snowhorn Mountains. The wind was howling like a wounded beast. The first sound that caught Silas Granger's ear was not the wind. It was the sharp, high-pitched wail of something smaller, more fragile. He pulled his horse to a stop, snow crunching under hooves, and tilted his head toward the timberline. There it was again, a baby's cry. No, multiple. He narrowed his eyes and dismounted. The path hadn't been ridden in days. It cut through the trees like a scar. His boots sank ankle-deep with each step. He led his horse by the reins, listening, his breath visible in sharp puffs. The sound grew louder as he approached a clearing near an old fence post, half rotted and half buried in snow. And there she was, a woman, barely upright, tied cruelly to the post with barbed wire, her arms bound behind her, skin torn, wrists bleeding. Snow clung to her lashes and the edges of her hair, now frozen in place. Her lips were cracked, her face pale as death, save for bruises blooming violet across her cheekbones. At her feet, 3 bundles, infants, newborns, no older than a day. One whimpered weakly. The other 2 lay silent, wrapped in what looked like the shredded remains of a nightgown. The woman's head moved slightly. She was conscious, barely. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered. Silas dropped to one knee beside her without hesitation. He pulled off his gloves and checked each of the babies. Breathing, shallow but steady. Skin, cold, the kind of cold that traveled into the bone. "You're coming with me," he said, voice low, steady, certain. She blinked slowly, like it took effort to register the words. He took a knife from his boot and sliced the barbed wire. It had bitten deep into the skin of her forearms. Blood welled where the rusted steel tore free, but she did not scream. She did not even flinch. He wrapped his arms around her waist to hold her steady as her legs gave out. Her body was limp, heavy with exhaustion and blood loss. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, cradling her against his chest. Then the babies. One by one, he gathered them. He tucked the smallest against his coat, secured them using a thick wool blanket from his saddle. They barely stirred. The wind picked up, slicing across the open space. He shielded them with his body as best he could. His horse nickered anxiously nearby. Silas glanced toward the horizon. They had a half-mile back to his cabin. Uphill. Through snow. He adjusted his grip on Marivel, tightened the wrap on the infants, and whispered, not to her, not to the babies. Maybe to the wind or maybe to God. You don't die here. Not on my land. He mounted the horse with care, keeping her in front of him, the babies tucked between them. She weighed next to nothing. The infants were lighter than winter rabbits. The cold had drained them all. Time was not their friend. The trail back was slow, the wind relentless, but Silas moved without pause. There was no time to ask who she was or what demons chased her. Only time enough to keep her alive. The cabin was dark when they reached it, the fire long gone cold. Silas kicked open the door, carried her straight inside, and laid her gently on a bed of quilts near the hearth. The babies came next. He set them in a basket lined with rabbit pelts, then turned to stoke the fire with hands that didn't shake. Not yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that led to her place of pain. Inside, Silas worked by firelight, silent and certain. A stranger had been left to die. But not here. Not on his land. The cabin was no more than 4 wooden walls and a sloped roof, groaning under the weight of snow. But it was dry, and the fire Silas Granger had kindled now crackled with life. Warmth crawled out slowly from the hearth, pushing back the cold that clung to the corners of the room like a second skin. Silas moved with practiced silence. He hung his soaked coat by the fire and peeled off his gloves, revealing calloused, cracked hands. Meridel lay unconscious on a bed of piled wool blankets in the corner. Her lips were blue, her hands were wrapped loosely in strips of linen. She had not stirred since they arrived. The babies had begun to mewl, low and weak, but alive. Silas filled an iron pot with goat's milk from a jug he had hidden behind stacked wood and placed it on the fire to warm. He found a small feeding spoon carved from pine and set it beside a tin bowl. Then he walked over to the woman. She was barely breathing. He dipped a cloth into a pail of warm water, wrung it out, and began cleaning the dried blood from her ankles and calves. The bruises went deep, mean, purple-black swells along her shins. Someone had kicked her hard and often. Her knees were scraped raw. He worked gently, dipping, wiping, covering her legs again with the edge of the blanket. She did not wake. Her breathing was shallow but even. When the milk warmed, he scooped some into the tin bowl and tested it on the back of his hand. Still too hot. He waited, watching the smallest baby, who had started to cry in earnest now, thin, urgent whimpers. He crouched beside the makeshift cradle and reached in. The infant's skin was warm again. That was a good sign. Silas used the spoon to feed tiny sips into the girl's mouth. She took it clumsily, then greedily. He did the same with the other two, pausing only to wipe their mouths and tuck the blankets closer around their heads. A faint sound drew his attention. From the bed, the woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering like leaves in wind. Her voice was cracked, barely audible. "My name's Maribel Quinn." Silas stood and crossed the room in 2 strides. He crouched beside her. "Silas," he said simply. Her lips moved again, but no sound followed. Her gaze slipped from him to the babies, who now rested quietly in the fire's glow. One of them sneezed, the smallest. Maribel's eyes flooded with tears, but she did not cry, not truly. Just a silent stream down cracked cheeks. Her body too tired, too broken to sob. Silas rose and walked to the back of the room. From a trunk, he pulled out an old fur cloak, thick elk hide lined with rabbit fur. He folded it and brought it to the basket, carefully placing it beneath the sleeping children. It made the cradle warmer, softer. When he looked back, Maribel was watching. He didn't speak. He only gave her a slow nod and returned to the hearth to add more wood. Sparks rose like fireflies and vanished into the cabin's smoke-stained rafters. Time passed quietly. The only sounds were the pop of the fire, the slow wind outside, and the shifting breath of 4 bodies slowly returning from the edge of death. Later, as Silas fed the fire one last time before resting, he heard her voice again. This time, firmer, not stronger, but certain. "You didn't leave us." He did not reply. He only sat by the fire, staring into it as the snow howled against the walls, and the cold beyond was held at bay. For now. The storm outside had softened to a hush. Snow still fell, but the wind had died, leaving behind a heavy stillness that wrapped around the cabin like a shroud. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady, casting flickers of gold across the rough timber walls. Maribel lay propped against folded blankets. Her face had regained some color, though the bruises still bloomed beneath her skin like ink stains. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from cold and crying, but she could speak now. Silas sat nearby, sharpening a blade against a whetstone with slow, careful strokes. He hadn't asked her anything, not who she was, not who had done this, not why she had been left to die. That silence, in its own way, was a kindness. "I was 17 when I married Joseph Quinn," Maribel said suddenly, her voice quiet but clear in the hush. "He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was lucky." Silas did not look up. He kept sharpening the knife, slowly, steadily. "I thought I was lucky too, at first," she continued. He brought me to a big house with tall windows and marble floors. I wore silk. I slept on feather pillows. But he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly, not gently. She paused, glancing at the sleeping babies beside the fire. Their tiny chests rose and fell in perfect rhythm. First daughter, he frowned. Second, he stopped speaking to me. Third, her voice cracked. Silas finally looked up. His eyes were calm, steady, waiting. When the third girl was born, he called the midwife a whore, said she cursed the womb. He told his brothers, I was no better than a mule, useless if I could not give him a son. That night they beat me. She turned her face slightly, revealing a faint scar along her jawline. Old, faded. I thought he might kill me. But instead he dragged me to the old fence post and tied me there. Said if the snow did not take me, then I was meant to live. Called it justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke. One reached instinctively toward the basket holding her daughters. They said girls are nothing but mouths to feed, she whispered. Silas set the blade down. He did not speak. Not right away. His jaw flexed once, tightly. Then he stood and walked toward her. His boots made no sound on the cabin floor. He knelt beside her cot and reached for her hand. It was swollen and bruised, the knuckles scabbed, but he took it as if it were made of glass, holding it gently in his large, weathered palm. He met her gaze. His voice was low and certain. Here, he said, your girls are the only thing worth feeding. Maribel's eyes filled with tears. This time she did not hold them back. She let them fall silently down her cheeks, mixing with the warmth of the firelight and the sound of her daughter's breathing. Silas stayed kneeling beside her, hand in hers, his presence quiet and grounding. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside that cabin, something had shifted. Not warmth exactly, something deeper, something that looked like the start of a promise. The snow had begun to melt around the edges of the cabin, turning white drifts to gray slush and revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. The mountains were waking from their long sleep, but with spring came more than thaw. It brought word from the lowlands. It was just after dawn when the knock came. Silas opened the door to find a woman bundled in a green wool shawl, breath fogging in the morning air. Her cheeks were flushed from the ride up the mountain, and her horse, tied to a nearby pine, still twitched from exertion. "Morning, Silas," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "Hattie," he greeted, stepping aside. "Come in." Maribel was sitting near the fire with one of the babies in her arms. The woman gave her a quick glance, then turned to Silas as he shut the door behind her. "It's about her," Hattie said, low. "Joseph Quinn's put out word." Silas didn't move. "He's telling folks she ran off in a fit, that she's unstable, says the babies are his by right and that she's keeping them in secret against the law." Maribel's eyes widened, her fingers clenched around the infant in her arms. "He's hired men," Hattie continued, "4 of 'em. Said they're just looking to bring a mother back where she belongs. But the way they ride, it ain't no rescue party." Silas nodded once. That was all. Hattie looked between them. "I rode up soon as I heard. They'll find this place, and when they do, they won't take her," Silas said. Maribel looked up at him, something unreadable passing through her gaze. Hattie hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Dried lentils, jerky, a flask of spirits. You'll need it." He accepted it with a silent nod. She left not long after. The rest of the day passed in motion. Silas repaired the latch on the rear window. He reinforced the door with a second crossbar and stacked firewood near the hearth so Maribel would not need to venture outside. He moved supplies to the root cellar in case they needed to hide or flee. He did not speak much. He sharpened his hunting knife until its edge gleamed like silver. Then he slid it into the sheath on his belt and kept it there. When night came, they slept lightly. The next morning, the air changed. It was too quiet. Even the birds had hushed. Then came the sound of hooves. 4 sets. Maribel clutched her daughters close. Silas opened the cabin door and stepped out. The riders were approaching slowly, their faces half hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They reined in a few yards from the front steps. The man in front had a scar down one cheek and a revolver at his side. "Silas Granger," he called out. "We come with claim." Silas said nothing. "That woman inside is Joseph Quinn's wife. She's his property. We've got every right to retrieve her and them girls." Silas stood still, arms loose at his sides, unarmed. He didn't move. His voice was calm, clear. "She was never his, and she sure as hell ain't yours." The man sneered. "You think this is over, mountain man?" Silas didn't blink. "You want to test that? Come back and try." The 4 riders stared at him in silence for a beat too long. Then the lead one tugged on his reins. "Let's go," he barked. "Not worth it today." They rode off without another word, snow spraying behind them, but their eyes had promised return. Silas stood at the threshold for a long time after they vanished. Inside, Maribel exhaled slowly, still clutching her daughters, her heart a thunder in her chest. They were safe, for now. But the shadows from the lowlands were not done reaching up the mountain. Not yet. Spring unfurled slowly across the mountainside, softening the snowpack and coaxing green buds from bare branches. The days stretched longer, and the cabin, once a refuge against death's chill, began to feel almost like a home. Maribel moved with quiet purpose now. Her steps no longer staggered. She no longer flinched when the wind blew or when wood cracked beneath the fire. She had taken to cooking small meals over the hearth, simple things, stew made from pine roots, wild onions, and whatever Silas brought back from the woods. Sometimes wild mushrooms, sometimes rabbit, once a wild turkey, more often grouse. The 3 babies, Eloise, Ruth, and June, grew stronger by the week. Their cheeks plumped, their cries grew louder, then sweeter, like birds just learning how to sing. They slept in a row of soft nests fashioned from coyote pelts and hay, lined with pieces of an old quilt Silas had never used until now. Mornings were the quietest. Maribel would rise before the sun, tend to the fire, check the girls. Silas would already be gone, out hunting or checking traps. He never left a note, but always returned. Their conversation stayed sparse, not cold, just gentle, like 2 people learning the language of each other's silence. He never asked about the past again. She never spoke of it. The words had been buried like bones beneath the frost. They both knew there was no fixing what had been done, only surviving what remained. Still, small comforts began to take root. One afternoon, Maribel found Silas at the workbench outside the cabin. His coat was off. The sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up, revealing weathered forearms. He held a carving knife and a thin plank of cedar. She watched in silence as he worked, whittling each piece with quiet precision. He did not look up, but he knew she was there. Later that night, she saw what he had made. 3 wooden plaques, each no longer than a handspan, hung above the baby's resting place. They bore 3 names in neat carved script: Eloise, Ruth, June. Each letter had been carefully smoothed, the wood oiled so that it caught the firelight. Maribel pressed her fingers to her mouth to keep from crying. No one, not even her own kin, had ever carved her daughters' names into anything permanent. Now they hung over their heads like prayers. The days turned gold and green. Maribel began to sing to the girls in the evenings, soft lullabies she remembered from childhood, songs her mother used to hum while braiding her hair. Silas would sit by the door, his long frame leaned against the jamb, sharpening tools or polishing his rifle, always listening. One evening the wind shifted. Rain was coming. The air smelled of soil and pine. Maribel was stirring a pot over the fire, humming beneath her breath. Silas sat nearby, cleaning a pair of rabbit pelts. Without turning, without meaning to plan the moment, she spoke his name. Not just his first, but the full weight of it. Silas Granger. The room stilled. He turned to her, slowly. His hand stopped moving. His eyes caught the light of the fire and held it, like embers that had waited for breath. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked, as if hearing his name from her lips had changed something inside him. Maribel turned then, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't had before. "I never said thank you," she whispered. "Not properly." Silas rose, quiet as always, and stepped closer, but didn't touch her. He looked down at the bubbling pot, then at the girls sleeping behind her, and finally back into her eyes. "You didn't need to," he said. A long silence settled between them. Not awkward, not unsure, just full. Full of things that didn't need saying yet, but lived there now, in the air, in the fire, in the way they existed beside each other. She smiled then, the smallest curve of her lips. Not the kind of smile that meant everything was fixed, but the kind that meant something had begun. And Silas Granger, the man who had not spoken 10 sentences a day since she'd met him, nodded once and went back to his seat. Outside, the wind picked up. The rain had not yet started, but it would. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and the quiet had never felt more like peace. The storm rolled in just after dusk, low and fast across the mountain, turning the wind cruel and the sky into a white, roiling fury. Snow slashed sideways against the cabin walls, thick enough to erase tracks in minutes, wild enough to make a man lose direction within steps of his own front door. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed. The windows shook in their frames. Silas stood by the back wall, checking the last of the shutters, while Maribel held Ruth and June close, her body curled around them. Eloise slept soundly beside the fire, unaware of the rising tension in the room. Then Silas froze. He stepped to the window, brushed the frost with the back of his knuckle, and looked out into the blizzard's swirl. Figures, 3 of them, horsemen moving through the storm, cloaks drawn tight, heads bowed against the wind. They came slow, deliberate, pushing against the mountain's resistance like they owned it. Silas backed away from the window. "It's them," he said. Maribel's breath caught. She didn't need to ask who. One look into Silas's face told her. Joseph had found them. He turned to her, voice low and urgent. "Take the girls, follow the creek. Stay low. Do not stop. Don't come back unless it's with law." Her eyes widened, but before she could protest, he was already moving. He went to the corner, pulled out the old elk fur cloak, wrapped it around her shoulders, and tucked a bundle of jerky, dried apples, and a small flask into her satchel. Then he unsheathed a small blade, not longer than her hand, and pressed it into her palm. "Keep it close. If they catch up, do not hesitate." She stared at him, mouth trembling. "What about you? I'll lead them the other way." He kissed Eloise's head once, quick and silent, then turned to her again. "Go now." Maribel bundled the girls, 2 in her arms, 1 strapped to her back, and slipped out the back, vanishing into the trees. Silas watched the door swing closed behind her. Then he went to work. He dragged a spare coat onto a broomstick and tied it to a fence post near the southern trail. He lit an oil lamp and tucked it behind a log to cast shadows. Then he rode his own horse halfway down the trail and looped its reins to a tree, as if it had been left there in haste. He even lit a small fire just past the trail's bend, enough smoke to draw attention, enough heat to confuse. Then he returned to the cabin and waited. The knock came minutes later, hard, unwelcome. Silas opened the door to find 3 men, snow-covered and grim. At the front stood Joseph Quinn. He had not changed much, still handsome in that cold, polished way, but his eyes were colder than the storm behind him. "Stoker, she took what's mine," he said, voice slicing through the wind. The girls carry my name." Silas stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "You come this far for lies? I come for blood. I ran from you because you left her to die." "She belongs to me," Joseph snarled, pulling a pistol from his belt. Silas didn't move. "She belongs to herself." Joseph's jaw twitched. "Last chance." Silas stood tall, unarmed, unflinching. "You'll have to shoot me." One of the men behind Joseph stepped forward, swinging the butt of his rifle. The blow caught Silas on the shoulder. He staggered backward, hit the doorframe, and collapsed to one knee, snow soaking into his shirt, crimson blooming at the seam. Joseph stepped forward, gun aimed. "And then, drop it." A new voice cut through the air, loud and righteous. A lantern swung from the tree line. Sheriff Mather rode into view, flanked by 2 deputies, rifles raised. Joseph turned just in time to see Maribel step out of the woods behind them, her cloak torn, face streaked with snow, and resolve. "Tell them what you did," she said, voice hard, "or I will." Joseph froze. The sheriff's horse snorted. "Arrest him," Mather ordered. Joseph dropped the gun. The deputies dismounted and cuffed all 3 men, dragging them off through the snow. Joseph's protests were thin, his voice cracked by disbelief. Maribel rushed to Silas, who was still slumped against the door, blood dripping from his shoulder into the snow. She dropped beside him, eyes full of tears but not panic. "You're not dying," she said. "You hear me?" He grunted, breath ragged. "Not planning on it." "Good." She reached to press her hand against the wound, stopping the blood. "Because I am not going to bury the only man who stood between us and hell." Silas blinked up at her. Then, despite the pain, he smiled. "Knew you'd come back." Spring crept back into the valley, with wildflowers pushing through thawed earth and robins singing from pine branches. The storm had passed, and the worst of the wounds had begun to heal, on skin, in memory, and between 2 people who had nearly lost everything. Silas's shoulder mended slowly. Maribel helped him bandage it each day with calm, steady hands. He never complained, she never fussed. Life had taken a cruel turn, and yet here they were, still breathing, still moving, still building something from what remained. With the danger behind them, they rebuilt the cabin together. What had once been a battered shelter for survival was now becoming a home. Silas extended the east wall to make room for a larger hearth. Maribel painted the shutters a faded green, using leftover pigment from an old can Hattie had brought up from town. Soon, they decided to open their doors to travelers. There were always men on the trade trail, fur traders, timber haulers, ranch hands riding from one county to the next. Word spread that a hot stew and a safe night's sleep could be found near the ridge, just below the second switchback. They called it the Hearth at Granger Ridge. Maribel cooked meals that warmed the stomach and softened the heart. Venison stew, root vegetable hash, sweet cornbread with honey. Silas hunted and chopped wood, maintained the stables, and made sure no trouble ever crossed the porch. The 3 girls grew fast. Eloise walked first. Ruth said her first word, "Fire." June sang before she spoke. Guests came and went, and with each passing day, laughter began to echo more often inside the cabin. One evening, after the last rider had left and the girls were asleep, Maribel stepped out to find Silas on the porch, sanding down a rough board. He looked up at her, reached into a satchel by his feet, and pulled something out. A shawl, thick, woven by hand, dyed deep burgundy with dark thread embroidery. On one corner, in careful stitching, were 3 initials, E.R.J., and beneath them, in all capital letters, Worthley. She took it without speaking, ran her fingers over the thread. Her breath caught. "You made this?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "For you," he said. "Because you are—" She swallowed hard, pulling the shawl close to her chest. A pause hung between them, long and rich. Then she said it. "You chose us when you could have walked away." Silas did not answer with words. Instead, he stepped forward, took her hand gently, and looked into her eyes. There was no proposal, no declaration, just a promise. That night, with the fire crackling and the mountains silent, they exchanged their vows, not with gold rings or a gathering of guests, but with soft voices and steady hearts. Silas offered her a string of carved beads, polished smooth and tied with twine, one for each of the girls. He looped them over their tiny wrists as they slept. For Maribel, he offered nothing but a hand. She took it, and in doing so, took everything that mattered. There were no flowers, no priest, no music. Just two people and a fire, and that was enough. Spring had fully claimed the mountain now. The snow was long gone from the ridge, replaced by soft moss and wild violets that curled along the stone path leading up to the cabin. The scent of pine mingled with something warmer, wood smoke, wild herbs, fresh bread baking in the hearth. Children's laughter rang out across the yard. Eloise, Ruth, and June chased each other around the porch steps, their dresses stained with grass and joy. Their hair, sun-warmed and wild, bounced as they ran. Maribel watched them from the kitchen window, her hands dusted with flour, a soft smile playing on her lips. The hearth at Granger Ridge had grown into something more than a refuge. It was now a stopping place, a quiet legend among riders and traders. Travelers came up the switchback trail not just for food, but for peace, for something that felt like home, if only for a night. They would sit at the rough-hewn table, steaming mugs of pine tea in hand, and listen to the girls' laughter outside. Maribel served them with quiet grace, sometimes slipping a warm roll into their coat pockets for the road ahead. Silas stayed mostly out back, tending to the garden rows he'd built by hand, potatoes, carrots, squash, and beans. When the girls napped, Maribel taught local children to read by chalkboard and charcoal. Some walked 5 miles for her lessons. Others stayed long after the letters faded, just to hear her sing. Every night, the fire in the hearth was lit with care, not because they feared the cold, but because they had once known it too well to forget. One evening, after the last guest had gone, Silas sat on the porch steps, boots dusted with earth, a basket of green beans beside him. The sun was sinking into the hills, casting the world in gold. Maribel stepped out with 2 mugs in her hands and sat beside him. The girls darted around the yard, giggling, barefoot, alive. Maribel handed Silas his tea, then rested her hand on top of his. Her touch was light, familiar. His fingers curled beneath hers. She watched their daughters run wild beneath the setting sun. Then she turned to him, her voice soft. "This fire between us, it never went out." Silas looked ahead, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "It just needed a place to live," he said. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars began to blink through the dusk. No one passing by would know the story, not the whole of it, not the blood and storm, the fear and the fight, but they would see the way she smiled, the way he watched her, the way 3 little girls danced in a patch of mountain sunlight, and know that something powerful had been built here, not from wealth, not from war, but from the stubborn, beautiful kind of love that survives even the worst of winters. And stays. Thank you for riding with us through this tale of fire, frost, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was rare and warmth even rarer, Silas and Maribel proved that sometimes the strongest homes are built not from timber or stone, but from trust, from sacrifice, and from choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest places, love can take root and grow, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable journeys into the heart of the American frontier. where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Tap the bell so you never miss a story that just might stay with you forever.